I love hearing Dr. Goldman speak. So again, I'm Carole House. On cybersecurity issues, I've had the privilege of working in a lot of really cool places on cybersecurity and emerging tech issues in legislative, executive, regulatory bodies, including 2 tours in the White House, most recently at the National Security Council under President Biden, ranging on issues from federal agency cybersecurity to supply chain risk management to disrupting ransomware. And something that I really learned in most of those roles is something that I think that all the policymakers in this room really have to struggle with, which is that policy without implementation, backed by resourcing, prioritization, capability, political will, is impotent. So therefore, we have to do something about it. We need to make sure that it's not just policy and a statement and a talking point, but that it's actually backed by real action. And that can be very difficult. Cyber can be a priority and it still be extremely difficult for us to achieve our desired end states. And I think that was really a huge undercurrent behind some major shifts that were evident in President Biden's most recently published National Cyber Strategy, specifically focusing on rebranding responsibilities and aligning incentives to favor long-term investment in this space. And I think that's really important. Embracing the fact that responsibility does not just sit with the government here, it must sit with industry entities, like I said, who are the entities that are deploying and operating these systems and also are on the front lines. They are the most targeted. They are the most capable in most instances to be able to defend against this. And it may not always seem fair. In the physical world, we don't expect companies to be the ones defending against state actors. But in the cyber world, it is inherent and it is necessary. We have to have those industry partnerships. So we have an incredibly complex landscape of policy issues, legal, national security, technological and economic issues that all serve as the strategic backdrop here for cyber issues, especially as digital economies grow and we get an increasing integration between physical and digital infrastructure and services. But we need to make sure that these services are secured. And that's going to require a mixture of sticks and carrots. It demands addressing some very tough issues, both in complexity as well as long lead times. For example, we're going to have to think about regulation of software and responsibility and open source software security. These are tough issues: freedom of speech implications, transparency and privacy, extremely fragmented authorities across, in the US, 16 critical infrastructure sectors, all of which have lots of subsectors underneath them. But we will have to address these. Future digital economies will not be economies without critical protections that we need in place and ensured for consumers and societies. These demand a balance of security controls as well as ensuring civil liberties and privacy preservation. So the debate needs to be around where that balance is struck, not that we go extremely in one direction or the other. So we need to take timely, outcome-oriented action to examine, dissect, debate, and address these issues. So given the remarks by my colleagues on state actors, I'll very quickly cover just a couple of issues in the threat landscape, but I'm really going to drive into the cybercrime space, I think said by someone from the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network for many years when I was at Treasury. But first, we have state actors. Obviously, they're targeting us and many of the nations in this room, if not all of us. So as underscored in this year's National Intelligence Assessment, China probably represents the broadest, most active, persistent cyber threat to the US government and private sector networks. They are positioned and capable of launching cyber attacks to disrupt critical infrastructure. And if they feel that there is an imminent threat for a conflict with the US, they will likely take action. We're concerned about dependence on Chinese technologies and infrastructure, like Dawn was speaking to earlier. And with Russia, besides its continued destabilizing invasion and war of aggression against Ukraine, Russia also continues its cyber operations against Ukraine, as well as many other countries, and positioning itself to better be able to target US infrastructure like underwater cables and industrial control systems. And the US government just recently attributed attacks against the US water and healthcare sectors to Iranian-affiliated hackers. So we have a lot to worry about on the state actor level. But I really want to focus especially on cybercrime by criminal groups, especially because we've seen, and I will also especially focus on ransomware here, that non-state actors can achieve state-level consequences at times in cybercrime. Ransomware is the most pervasive form of disruptive cybercrime, and why ransomware became it rose to the level of national security priority at the National Security Council was because it can take down pipelines. And at FinCEN, which is the US Financial Intelligence Unit, I cared about business email compromise fraud and tons of identity theft and cyber crimes that were targeting institutions and hurting consumers and economies for billions. But BEC doesn't take down pipelines. Ransomware takes down pipelines. It's a disruptive cybercrime. We had to prioritize it and focus on it. So I'm very glad to see that the Egmont group of FIUs, financial intelligence units, will be here speaking tomorrow. May already be here, and I know that there's other financial authorities here because I would really be remiss as a former Treasury official to not talk about the role that money plays here in cybercrime. Most cybercrime is a financial crime. It is for the purposes of making money, like most crime. There, of course, are exceptions. There are hacktivists. There's certainly other types of surveillance and espionage activity occurring. But whether we're talking about stealing of credentials to use later in a fraud, or stealing of data that will be sold and monetized, stealing intellectual property that will be illicitly used to drive economic developments, or just straight up stealing money from banks and SWIFT hacks, or from decentralized finance platforms that have not properly integrated principles of designing security from the very beginning, and enabling groups like Lazarus Group, North Korea's major cybercrime group. Most of cybercrime is financial in nature. It's just at some point in the cycle, either very early or sometimes at the end of that financial crime cycle. So crypto also plays a role here. It's true, it is a cyber criminal's favorite way to launder. I know that the prior panel talked about the benefits of public ledgers. I agree. I don't know why all the criminals are using a public ledger to publish their transactions. I hope they keep doing it, and that we can scale regulation and enforcement to take advantage of that, but we have not yet. And the reality is that if it was very hard to successfully launder and cash out these proceeds, it would not still be a favored way to launder and to extort victims in criminal acts like ransomware. So we need to do something about it. That is not blockchain's fault. It's not the technology's fault. It is the people and businesses that have implemented it. And it's also because of insufficient international regulation and implementation of the first ever international standards for virtual assets that we passed at the FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, which is the international standards body for anti-money laundering. I think based on their last report, about 10% of global jurisdictions have largely implemented the standards that we passed 4 years ago. So at that rate, 40 more years before we get it. I'm sure it's not a linear adoption rate, but we need to take action to faster implement and enforce these standards. We must hold accountable these actors. And like I said, there's clear fixes here to move forward. There's a lot of legislative efforts and focus in the US on countering illicit finance and scaling the US government's ability to continue to bring enforcement actions, which they have been doing very well for many years, even if on very delayed timelines. The EU has also issued AML directives, and many other countries are implementing AML in their frameworks. It just takes time. So we need more early and often enforcement. I know the Army and me showing, I like my enforcement early and often. And we do need that. That's how we shape a sector and don't break it and bring huge enforcement actions 6 years after illicit activity is occurring. We need to bring it consistently and shape the sector to drive the policy objectives that we in societies have. Identity also plays a key role here. Identity is a huge vector of attack. There's major vulnerabilities. Identity compromises tend to be a major culprit in most ransomware attacks. They certainly are in fraud. And whether it's BEC fraud, account takeovers, identity weaknesses are huge. Some countries are making key steps in identity. I hope that the US will. I know that there's been some legislation also introduced in the US to try to address some of those concerns. So on disruption, right now, I appreciate the points that Dr. Goldman made about deterrence not really working very well below the show of force level. So we need to do something to really scale our ability to disrupt that activity. Enforcement does come too late. Sanctions, which we use a lot, and certainly a huge tool in the counter ransomware initiative and campaign the White House drove, but there's questions on the efficacy of the tool. That can't be our only tool that we leverage, especially if those actors aren't really using the US financial system. We need international partners to work with us on that. And ultimately, there's a lot of questions right now about, as other countries are building their interest in alternate payment systems and financial systems, the long-term efficacy and strength of those tools is in question. I still think we'll be strong for a long time, but it's something that we have to look to when thinking about what does our toolkit look like in 20 years. So to disrupt it, we need a whole-of-government approach. And what do? The answers are with responsibility and incentives. It's a mix of disruptive efforts to impose consequences effectively. I look forward to debating some of the discussions on disruption with Dr. Goldman. I think there's lessons also that we can learn from international frameworks and some of the issues that, again, Dr. Goldman, I appreciate all of her published literature on this, a need to focus on international standards here. In illicit finance, we learned in the 90s, I think that was when the FATF started, illicit financing in my jurisdiction will fund terrorism in yours. So we determined that we needed the FATF. And there are 200 member jurisdictions that comply with those standards and hold each other accountable to meeting them. There's an enforcement mechanism, there's teeth. We don't have that same level of agreement or enforcement or teeth in cyber frameworks. We have frameworks, we have multi-stakeholder international governance models for the internet. We have the UN cyber treaties, we have the Budapest Convention, but there's pieces of that framework that are kind of missing some of the teeth and implementation that we want. I think there's an opportunity to discuss some of the lessons there to implement standards for security for critical infrastructure, many of whom, especially managed service providers, provide services globally to all of our countries, and then also to make sure that we hold accountable cyber criminals inside of our borders. Not every country has that outlawed. Being a cyber criminal. So that's another kind of act that I think that we could take action on. And finally, when looking for partnerships with industry and with international partners, we need to find their centers of gravity and what the right levers are, sticks and carrots, whether it's looking at cyber insurance and investment on the positive promotion side, or looking at good enforcement mechanisms and partnerships to disrupt these transnational crime groups. There's a lot of opportunity for action. So thanks, y'all. We're going to move into a fun Q&A session. So, all right. Thank you.